Let's talk about the Einstellung Effect. Now, this comes from 1942 when a psychologist ran a series of water jar experiments showing that participants who learned one method of solving the puzzle that he was creating, solving the challenge that he gave, that once they used that, they would revert back to that same method over and over again. And this ties into something that's maybe kind of commonsensical, but it's good for us to name and acknowledge when we're trying to solve problems and treasure hunt and truth seek, is that we all succumb to this kind of Einstellung effect, in that we develop a method of solving a problem and then we want to use it over and over again. You've kind of sort of heard the phrase that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, that's true in terms of our mental strategies and habits also. And we want to be aware of it and acknowledge it so that we don't just always default to the same tool or method, even when it's not the best one for the situation, or it's not going to give us the best chance of getting the result or the solution that we want. So I have for you a few thoughts, a couple of insights, and then, as always, I've jotted down 5 tips, some practices that you can work on to help make use of this concept in your own life, work, fun, learning. So one is prior success can become a great mental shortcut, and it can help you. If you have some tried and tested methods of the past, that can be very good. Don't ignore those, don't disregard those. But similarly, don't just treat them as a mental shortcut where you just use that method because that's what you've used before, and you want to take the time to kind of stop and process and think about it. So be careful about prior strategies and successes. Treat them with respect. They may be useful, but don't assume that they're the right tool. The second one is expertise often creates a kind of blind spots. So this particular effect is especially true sometimes in experts who really know the tried and tested ways to address things. Now imagine, for example, that you're a medical doctor and you have to conduct really complex surgeries like brain surgery. Imagine a medical doctor coming in and saying, I don't use these new fancy technologies of the day. I use the old traditional ones, and they pull out like a 17th century skull saw. I don't know about you, but I'd probably not be in that doctor's office very much longer. And so we all know that, and we acknowledge that kind of reality, that there may be newer and better tools and solutions. Newer doesn't always mean better, but we want to make sure that we haven't just been tied to the mental equivalent of using, skull saws from the 17th century to solve our problems. And so keep in mind that expertise can be very, very valuable, but it can also kind of blind us to better practices if we're not careful, if we're not continually learning and growing, being open to new possibilities and practices. So here are 5 lessons or practices that you can use to just be aware of the Einstellung effect and make sure that it's not misleading you, taking you astray. First one is, don't just ask the question, what worked before? Also ask, what actually fits this situation? So realize that the solution needs to be specific to the context and the situation, and ask that. I'll give you an example. Like, say you're looking for some item, and there are many different searching methods. I have other videos on the grid method. I have a video on the spiral method, and these are different ways to search a physical area for an item. But different methods are appropriate for different situations. So just because you know the grid search method really well doesn't mean it's the best one for this situation. So you pause and you ask the question, what actually fits this situation? Maybe the spiral approach is a better approach than the grid approach, or maybe it's some hybrid, or maybe it's a third approach. So that's a good thing to ask. The second one is, when you see yourself just defaulting to a familiar method or approach to solving something, just pause and acknowledge it. Acknowledge that you're defaulting so that you can begin to consider whether or not that is the right one. So we need to get this into our conscious mind, because a lot of times the reason that we use sort of the familiar method is just because it's become habitual. So we're not really thinking about it. And you want to bring this into your conscious mind so you're making a choice about the method that you're going to be using. The third one is, practice solving problems in more than one way to teach yourself to stay and be flexible. So in other words, before you find yourselves in the high stakes situation, just on a daily basis, practice doing the same thing in different ways, and then compare and contrast the results that you get. So you may oftentimes find that one one way is really the best way to do it. And if you give yourself a little bit of time and you practice, though, you may find that there are multiple ways that you can get a good result. And each one has its pluses and its minuses. So you have to kind of decide which pluses do I really want, which minuses do I really want to avoid, and then you can make a decision about the practice that's going to be the best fit. Fourth one is when you're stuck, ask someone who does not share your background or approach. Find someone who has different default approaches. They have their own blind spots too, but different blind spots than you. So a partner can be really helpful to take a look at it and see how they would solve it and how they would approach it. And then you can be introduced to some new possibilities. And then finally, the fifth one is beware of the comfort of your past expertise. So sometimes your past expertise and the methods that you use can be the key to solving things quickly, efficiently, effectively, and getting where you want to go. But sometimes your past expertise can actually be the cage that locks you in. So you have to take the time to try to consider, to thoughtfully consider, is my past expertise, my past approach, something that's going to cage and lock me in, or a key that's going to help me get out and get where I want to go? And those are my 5 tips for how you can work your way through the Einstellung Effect. And for those of you, by the way, who've made it this far in the video and you know your German better than I do, I apologize for how I pronounce that if it's not perfect. A lot of my learning on these topics begins by reading, and then I take those readings and start putting them into practice in my own life and testing them out, and then I share them with people like you. So I hope you find this useful. I look forward to your comments.